This episode is brought to you by pastasworld.com, where you can find jigsaw puzzles, coffee and tea mugs, canvas and poster prints, iPhone cases, and more. You can even order custom items with your own pictures. Go to pastasworld.com or the Pastas World shop on Etsy to learn more.
You're listening to I Love This TV Show, The Golden Girls.
Hi, and welcome to the I Love This TV Show podcast. I'm your host, Noelle from pastasworld.com. Each season of this podcast will contain a TV show in full. This means the length of the season depends on the length of the TV show. The first season is, of course, The Golden Girls. The Golden Girls, Season 2, Episode 4, It's a Miserable Life. Dorothy comes home. She and Sophia discuss who they got to sign the petition. Blanche comes back. She only got one guy to sign it. Rose then arrives and says Mrs. Claxton won't sign the petition, and the tree's on her property. Rose: I know it doesn't make any sense. Why would she want to cut down that gorgeous 200-year-old oak tree? Sophia: because Frida Claxton is a miserable, vile, scum-sucking crank who gives nice old ladies like me a bad name. Believe me, she's a totally rotten human being. Rose doesn't want to give up on Mrs. Claxton, though, and thinks there might be some good somewhere in her. Blanche points out that everyone in the neighborhood hates her, and Dorothy follows up with the fact that most of the neighborhood kids dress up as her for Halloween. Rose thinks she just needs to be shown some kindness. She then starts a St. Olaf story, and everyone heads to the kitchen to escape, but Rose, of course, follows. Dorothy tries to cut her off, but it doesn't work. Rose decides to prove the girls wrong. She's going to be extra nice to Mrs. Claxton as much as she can. It's now the day of the hearing. The girls are at the courthouse waiting. Rose joins them and tells them that Mrs. Claxton has decided to save the tree. She took her a different homemade Danish every day. Mrs. Claxton arrives at the courthouse. Blanche greets her and is shocked at Mrs. Claxton's response. Blanche: well, Mrs. Claxton, how lovely to see you again. Mrs. Claxton: who are you? Blanche: I'm your neighbor, Blanche Devereaux. Mrs. Claxton: oh yeah, I didn't recognize you with your clothes on. Blanche: I beg your pardon? Mrs. Claxton: with my binoculars, I have a terrific view in your bedroom window. I think some of the stuff you do is illegal. I'm looking into it. Dorothy then tries to talk to Mrs. Claxton, but she insults Dorothy too. Rose finally steps up and thanks her for saving the tree, but Mrs. Claxton says she's actually there to make sure it's torn down. She then rips into Rose. Sophia jumps up to go after her, and Dorothy asks why. Dorothy: Ma, where are you going? Sophia: to throw some holy water on her. If she spits up pea soup and her head spins around, we're in big trouble. In the city council hearing room, they finally bring up the proposal to widen Richmond Street. Blanche jumps up to do the talking, and Dorothy is confused. She mentions she knows two of the members on the council. Dorothy: wait a minute, Blanche. Why should you do it? Blanche: because we'll have a better chance. Dorothy: I happen to be a wonderful orator, and two of the commissioners can verify that. Dorothy: Blanche, orator means speaker. Blanche: really? Oh, then somebody else do the talking. So Blanche sits back down, and Mrs. Claxton jumps up and says she doesn't care if the tree is cut down. Dorothy then tells them that they have 60 signatures from people who live on the block wanting to save the tree. But Mrs. Claxton again doesn't care about the tree. They continue to bicker. Mrs. Claxton then talks about pictures that she has of Blanche doing things. Mrs. Claxton: you want to look at pictures? I've got pictures of her roommate, the human Slinky. Blanche: shut up, Claxton. Ed: were there any pig faces recognizable? Blanche: you shut up too, Ed. The discourse continues about the tree, but now Rose joins in as well. Mrs. Claxton. Stop wasting the taxpayers' money. Yank out that tree. Start pouring cement. Rose. Mrs. Claxton, think about what you're doing. That beautiful old tree is 200 years old. How can you hate a living thing? Mrs. Claxton. I hate you. Rose. That's it. I have had all I'm going to take from you. Now, if you don't have the common decency to treat people like human beings, well, then I'm sure not going to waste my time on kissing your fanny. Now, if you don't like it, Mrs. Claxton, then you just sit there and shut up while we have our say, and if you don't like it, just drop dead. At the end of Rose's speech, Mrs. Claxton clutches her chest. As Rose says the last line about dropping dead, she does. As Rose walks back to her seat, Mrs. Claxton falls off hers. She makes quite a thud as she hits the ground. Everyone rushes over to see what has happened. Dorothy. What happened? Sophia. You know when you told her to drop dead? Rose. Yes. Sophia. I think she did. That night in the kitchen, Rose and Dorothy talk. Rose. Why do people die, Dorothy? Dorothy. Oh, Rose, please. I don't even know why fools fall in love. Rose. I killed her. I might just as well have shot her with a gun. Dorothy. Honey, the woman was 83. She had a heart attack. It was just a coincidence. Dorothy expresses her concern because Rose hasn't been sleeping. Blanche comes in and is concerned too, but she slips and says that she killed Mrs. Claxton 2 days ago. She just needs to move on. Blanche, however, is not in mourning. Rose is upset that Mrs. Claxton isn't having a funeral or being buried. Blanche talks about how many people will be at her funeral. She then tells them a story about how at the age of 16 she faked her death and there was a funeral for her. Turns out she won Miss Congeniality in a beauty pageant she was in. Instead of winning the whole pageant, she faked her death for revenge on the town for valuing her personality over her beauty. Sophia joins them and asks when Mrs. Claxton's funeral is going to be. Dorothy tells her there isn't going to be a funeral. Sophia says they should take care of the funeral. Rose comments about how sharing the funeral expenses equally is such a nice thought. But Sophia thinks Rose should have to cover half because she killed her. The four go to the funeral home. Blanche is panicked. The funeral director asks them if they are planning ahead for Mother as he looks at Sophia. Sophia gets cranky at him. Sophia. Hey, Puff Pfeiffer, how would you like a punch in your puff face? Rose grabs her as she advances on him. She then corrects him that the funeral is for a neighbor. They tell him that no one liked her and Rose killed her. Dorothy tries to take charge. Dorothy. About the funeral arrangements. We'd like something simple, tasteful yet, Blanche, incredibly cheap. He tries to sell them the most expensive casket right off the bat. He tells them it's gold-leafed and lead-lined. Dorothy, getting annoyed, tells him they are not burying Superman, and again, how much is the price? Rose is horrified at the price of $6,000 because her first house did not cost that much. He then tries to sell them one for $3,000. Blanche looks in the book of caskets and points out a pine box. It's only $200, and Blanche says they'll take it. Then they fight over what night to have the funeral. He tries to sell the rest of them on setting up their funeral in advance. It's now the night of the funeral. Sophia is listening to a baseball game at the funeral. No one else has come. Rose. I can't believe it. There was an announcement in the paper. Her friends must have realized she died. Why didn't they come? Dorothy. They were too busy celebrating. Rose decides to stay a little longer. A woman shows up. She's thankful she didn't miss it. Rose asks her if she would mind saying a few words. She is surprised, but accepts. She starts giving a beautiful speech about the deceased and all the nice things she had done. The girls look confused by these revelations. Rose starts to cry. But then the woman says the name Celia Rubinstein. Blanche tells her that this isn't that funeral, but it's for Frida Claxton. The woman is not amused, and she kicks the coffin. Rose is shocked. Rose, I guess you were all right. Frida Claxton didn't have a friend in the world. She didn't make any difference to anybody. She might as well never even existed. and Rose rushes out of the funeral space in hysterics. But the funeral director comes in with an urn and tells them Mrs. Claxton was cremated by mistake. He makes them take her urn. The next day, Blanche asks Dorothy if she heard some noises that night. She says she didn't hear anything. Blanche is freaking out, thinking that the house is haunted by Mrs. Claxton's spirit now. Sophia comes out, and Blanche asks her the same. Sophia says it was her. She ate expired cottage cheese. Rose comes in the front door very excited. She found a final resting space for Mrs. Claxton. She spread Mrs. Claxton's ashes all around the old oak tree. She goes on to tell them that after she did that, she went down to City Hall and informed them the tree is the final resting place of Mrs. Claxton. Now they're not going to cut the tree down. They all go outside to look at the tree, and they all talk a little philosophically. Sophia comes out and breaks the spell by pointing out that a Great Dane is also paying its respects by lifting its leg on the tree. I'll be right back after a quick break. Favorite quotes. Sophia. Because Frida Claxton is a miserable, vile, scum-sucking crank who gives nice old ladies like me a bad name. Rose. I think there's some good in everybody. Mrs. Claxton. With my binoculars, I can see right into your bedroom window. I think some of the stuff you do is illegal. I'm looking into it. Dorothy. Ma, where are you going? Sophia. To throw some holy water on her. If she spits up pea soup and her head spins around, we're in big trouble. Rose. How can you hate a living thing? Mrs. Claxton. I hate you. Rose. That's it. I've had all I'm going to take from you. Now, if you don't have the common decency to treat people like human beings, well, then I'm sure as hell not going to waste my time kissing your fanny. Now, if you don't like it, Mrs. Claxton, you just sit there and shut up while we have our say. And if you don't like it, then just drop dead. Go on, Dorothy. Sophia. You know when you told her to drop dead? Rose. Yes. Sophia. I think she did. Blanche. Rose, you have to put this thing behind you. You killed Mrs. Claxton 2 days ago. Blanche. It was hard to get my daddy angry, but once you did, he could be a real peckerwood. I adore that Sophia says that Frida Claxton gives nice old ladies like her a bad name. Oh my gosh. Every time she says that line, I practically fall out of my chair laughing. My neighbors probably hear my laughing at that. You know, it's quite interesting too that they're trying to save this tree because it is a situation of like nature and what was originally there versus like urbanization and growth of the city. You know, they're trying to widen the Richmond Street. I assume it's just a standard regular one lane each way like most residential streets are. You know, we never really hear anything about it being a busy street or a thoroughfare. So I'm not quite sure why there's a Richmond Street widening project going on. That's never actually really covered in the episode. I do find Frida Claxton as a crotchety old, cranky, mean, nasty lady to be a rather compelling character because she stands strong in her beliefs that she hates humans and she hates nature and she hates this and she hates that. And the only reason she took Rose's prune Danish is apparently because she was constipated. Which kind of works with the crotchety, crankety old lady personality, I guess. But yeah, Rose's determination to constantly see the good in people, even when there isn't, it's an endearing quality, and I actually feel very bad for Rose in this episode. You know, especially by the end when she's like, she really wasn't liked, she really isn't missed. You know, she finally comes to terms with that at the end of the episode, possibly, but I think that it's still going to upset her and haunt her. No, it was not her fault that Mrs. Claxton had a heart attack. We have no idea what her diet was like. We have no idea if she exercised or anything of that nature. The sad truth is, in that kind of situation, it is what it is. It's like as we get older, we do have more and more health problems. She could have had high blood pressure and other things, maybe high cholesterol, and all of those work together for her to have her heart attack. But it could be the fact that she constantly yells and screams at everybody that her blood pressure is always up, even if she is on blood pressure stabilizing and lowering medication, to the point where all that yelling and everything just eradicated the effects of the blood pressure medicine. People's attitudes towards her were quite unique. The kids in the neighborhood would wear a Frida Claxton costume at Halloween. That's a new one. I've never heard anything like that before. Her negativity clearly made her a very scary person. So I guess if she didn't like adults, she also didn't like kids. But I do gotta say, I really do like that scene in the room, the courtroom, the hearing room. I'm still not 100% sure where or what it is. But where Rose actually stands up to her, because Rose, being as nice as she normally has a tendency to back down and let people just like walk all over her, use her, abuse her, etc. And in this case, she actually stood up for what she believed in. Now, the funeral. Oh my goodness. I have no idea what the lady's name is who popped up at the very end and was talking all of these positive, nice things, and then drops the name Celia Rubinstein. Clearly not the lady in the pine box. From what she said of Celia Rubinstein, she was probably in the gold leaf casket because everybody loved her and they probably pitched in. Man, it's crazy that a casket would cost $6,000 back then. I've recently had to look at all that kind of stuff, and it's like prices are insane to be buried. But yeah, the fact that she kicked the pine box. Kicked it! Oh, that evil woman from Richmond Street. I think that's what she said to her. What she said to the girls, what she asked them. And then she actually turns around and kicks the pine box. Turns out, though, Mrs. Claxton was not in the pine box, so she kicked an empty box. I do find it interesting that Mr. Puffpfeifer waited until the very, very end when they were leaving to finally drop that bombshell on them. I don't know, maybe he was figuring they'd ask for a refund on the pine box? Technically, though, since it was in an urn, they probably should have got a little bit of a refund. But, and Rose really did get her final revenge on Mrs. Claxton at the end of the episode. Because she had the ashes, they didn't know what they wanted to do with them. And so she poured the ashes all around the base of the 200-year oak tree and made it Mrs. Claxton's burial spot. She single-handedly got a revenge on Mrs. Claxton for being an evil, vicious, nasty woman and did the exact opposite. She hated that tree, but she buried her essentially on that tree so that she was going to be stuck with it for the rest of, well, maybe eternity is the right word here. But I mean, at some point, the tree is probably going to die. So at that point, she's going to just kind of be in the dirt there in the sidewalk, I'm guessing. That remains to be seen as well. Oh my gosh. And then Sophia pointing out, yeah, that Great Dane's paying its respects, all right. It's lifting its leg on the tree. That's just hilarious. On the plus side, though, the dog was making sure that her ashes did not blow away. So, yes, that is an absolutely amazing episode. I love it, but I mean, I love every episode of The Golden Girls, and I hope you do too.
It's been great reliving this episode with you. Please check out the podcast website, anchor.fm/I love this TV show, no spaces. You'll be able to see the show notes and also support this podcast. To check out everything I'm up to and nerding about, head over to pastasworld.com. You'll also find additional content there. Thanks for listening, and stay golden.